Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, we're talking about how the Greek myths of the world of the New Testament impact how we listen and pay attention to the Genesis debate. Now, of course, many people struggle with how could Genesis still be true? How could Adam be historical and everything about the world about science still be true? Now, something really important in that discussion oftentimes becomes a question of what did the New Testament writers think about? What did Jesus and Paul, did they think that Adam was historical or the text was historical? And something really important to understand is the context they were in. So today we're going to look at that context. Today we're going to look at the world of the New Testament writers. Now, many people realize that the New Testament was written in Greek, and therefore we're going to pay attention. We're going to listen to a lecture by a classical scholar on Greeks that doubted the myths of their day. Now, they still might have thought they were true, but they didn't necessarily think they were all historical. And that could really change our discussion, because oftentimes in the discussion people might assume just because someone like Jesus or Paul references Adam or Noah or something about Genesis that they must obviously think they're historical. Well, of course, that doesn't necessarily follow, right? I mean, and think about the quote, with great power comes great responsibility. Just because I'm quoting that doesn't mean I think that where that came from is historical, which is of course Spider-Man. Uncle Ben says that to Peter Parker. But enough of that. So you might be thinking, okay, well, if Genesis isn't historical, that obviously means it's not true and the Bible's wrong. Well, just because something's not historical doesn't mean it's not true, right? We've all heard of different stories like parables of Jesus, or in this instance, the Greek myths. People thought they were true. It doesn't mean and they necessarily thought they were historical. Additionally, just because the first sin of the Genesis text of Adam and Eve, just because that's not historical doesn't mean that sin is not a thing, right? I mean, there's plenty of biblical texts where clearly state that sin is a thing, right? And Genesis not being historical doesn't mean the Bible is wrong, right? If the text never claimed to be historical, it doesn't mean it's obviously it doesn't mean it's historical, right? There's a big thing here, which is nothing about Christianity, the truthfulness of it is based on the historicity of Genesis, right? The evidence for Jesus' resurrection, the historical evidence, that has no influence on whether Genesis is historical. So our reason for thinking Genesis is historical, it has nothing to do with whether Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus rose from the dead, doesn't mean that, well, if Genesis is not historical, doesn't suddenly mean Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That doesn't follow. The historical evidence doesn't go away, right? So that's a bit of an intro, but I know you guys have missed it. So here's an actual intro. Hope you guys enjoyed that. The classic video intro that everybody's missed, of course. So yeah, let's get into it. We're going to talk, comment, listen to the lecture by R. Scott Smith, professor at the classics, or he's a professor of classics at the University of New Hampshire. And this is a video that has like 77 views or something, but it's really, really interesting, talking about whether the Greeks believed their myths. And um, you can check out the link in the description. But also, one more thing before we get in there is, if you do struggle with any of the questions of, hey, if Genesis isn't historical, it doesn't mean that it must be Christianity's fault or something. Whatever objection you have, you can check the description. I've done a number of videos on those topics. Any objection you have, it'll be in that description. So let's get into it.
Right. We're going to come back to some of these in just a little bit. So what I want to do is I want to start out by taking a look at a single myth or a mythical system. I want to tell you a story, and I want all of you, if you can, to think about one question. And that question is are all the stories that I'm telling about this myth, is it, are they all the same type? And the reason why I'm asking that is I'm really interested in trying to figure out what the Greeks themselves thought a myth was. A preliminary definition of what myth is a story that the Greeks told that had some relevance to their culture, right? That's a very vague definition. It's one that is contested by almost every scholar of myth, but it's a useful way of starting, right? So it's a story. But those stories have different kinds of values. And as I tell the story of Theseus,
Just to let you know, I'm sure someone might be thinking, oh, well, if Genesis is myth, that means it must not be historical. Um, well, and that's not actually true. So there were many historical aspects of the myths of the ancient Near East and of Greece. So that's simply false. That just because something's myth doesn't mean there aren't historical aspects. Now, typically, of course, if it's a myth, it's not all historical. But most specifically, most importantly, it doesn't mean that it's false. As we're going to get into, they still had very important values that they taught through their myths, and that's most important for what many scholars at least argue the Genesis text is about, not necessarily the historical aspects.
who is one of my favorite heroes, you might hear some stories that sound like it could have happened, and other stories where there are some things where you're like, that doesn't seem right to me or realistic. And that's really the kind of tension between the definition of myth. Does myth require something to be fantastic and crazy to be a myth, or is myth something more general than that? So let's start not in Athens, but in a very small place just to the south of Athens in Greece, which is located in a place called Troezen. Troezen is a city that's very important in the Greek mentality because this is where the hero Theseus was born. His father left, left him as a baby. He went back to Athens, which is just to the north, where you see Athens. This is a German map. I apologize for that. But before he left, the king Aegis left a sword and sandals beneath a giant rock. And he did so because he wanted to make sure that his son, who was going to be a great hero, could have a way to identify himself by the sword, which had a hilt that was his own, but also because he had to show a feat of strength in order to pick up the stone to get the sandals and rock. When Theseus was about 16 or 17, he was extremely, extremely young and powerful. He picked up the stone, he got the sandals, and he then got the sword. Now, if you were in antiquity and you wanted to go from Troezen to Athens, the smart way to do it is to take a boat. But Theseus said, I'm not taking a boat. I am going to go the long way, the land route. And on the way, I'm basically going to get rid of all those horrible people that are causing trouble to the land. So that's what Theseus decided to do. We have a very, very fine Athenian pot, which shows Theseus's adventures around the peninsula. One of
Warning there, those Greeks liked their sculptures without clothes.
the monsters, or we shouldn't say monsters, but one of the bad guys that he encounters is a guy called Sinis. This is a guy who basically took pine trees, bent them down, tied travelers to it, let it go, and flung the poor people to their deaths. Another one, if you look to the bottom right, if you can see the screen, there's a guy with a turtle at the bottom. He was famous for basically having travelers wash his feet. And when they did, he kicked them over the cliff. They fell into the water below, and a man-eating turtle would come and devour him, right? A third person in the upper right-hand corner was Procrustes. He basically made sure that all travelers fit his bed. And if you were too short, he would pound you out with a meat tenderizer, just like you were a steak. But if you were too tall, he would lop off your feet and maybe your head to make you fit the bed. right? So all along the way, Theseus basically defeated these people who were causing trouble in the landscape, and he made the world peaceful for the Athenians and other people.
Seems like a nice guy.
We have one question already.
Yes. Who does that?
Emmy
Emmy.
wanted to know
Yep.
why a sword?
Why a sword? This is a good question. Theseus oftentimes will be seen as holding a club. Do you see at the bottom? This is because Aegis, his father, was known to carry a sword. So it was a symbol of his father. Exactly. Good, very good question. And you can see the sword when he goes in the center, right? This is the famous Minotaur that we're going to turn our attention to so far. Okay. But so far, we see that he gets to Athens. He meets his father. He takes over kind of this, like the role of being the prince, the heir apparent. But there's a problem.
You might be thinking, okay, like why am I watching this? This is weird. What's the purpose? We'll get to it.
Athens at the time was subjugated by the Cretans, and that's the island to your south or to the bottom. King Minos had basically come to Athens and defeated them. And as compensation for the loss of his son, which happened in Athens, King Minos made Athens give 14 young people, 7 young men, 7 young women, to be taken on a boat all the way from Athens to Crete to be fed to the Minotaur. Now, the Minotaur is a half bull, half man creature that was held in a very complicated maze called the Labyrinth. And there he was held, but he had to be fed. And to punish the Athenians, King Minos made them do this every single year. Theseus, now, I don't know if you've ever seen or read The Hunger Games. And if you have, you'll remember that Katniss volunteered to be the tribute for whatever, were they Section 12, Zone 12, whatever. Anyway, Theseus, like Katniss, volunteered to be one of the 14 young men and women brought to the island to be eaten by the Minotaur. But of course, he wins, and he comes back successfully, right? So the Minotaur in the story, as you can see, we have the mother. The mother had slept with a bull, very strange thing. And the result was a Minotaur. Not just a Minotaur, but a very jacked up weightlifting type of creature. Look at those muscles for a baby Minotaur. Absolutely incredible, right? But the Minotaur is the first thing that we hear in this myth that is actually fantastic, right? Someone like being mean on a road is not very problematic. But the Minotaur, right, a half man and half bull, is something very different, right? So this myth has stories that are completely normal that we can accept. But if you encountered today a half man, half bull, I imagine you would be pretty surprised. So for the Greeks, later Greeks in particular, these kind of like weird, fantastic things were then not able to be believed, and therefore they tried to explain them. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is how the Greeks tried to explain away the fanciful things that we find in myth. We also have a Victoria. So the second question I'd like to ask, in addition to what is myth, is really the thing that's going to kind of formulate our thoughts for the rest of this presentation, which is what about these Greek mythical stories are objectionable, right? Like that's not possible, or that's not right, or that's problematic. And we're going to find out that there's a lot of problematic things that take place in Greek myth that the Greeks themselves had to wrestle with to figure out what was really behind the story. And that's what we're going to turn to now. Good. Are there any questions so far, Kayla? Are we doing okay?
I think we're doing okay. I'm not sure if Emmy still had a question. Her hand was raised. I didn't know if it was just on accident or if it was just raised.
Okay, we're all good. Thank you.
People, I want you to know that this Emmy girl, she's the star of the show. You gotta watch for this.
All right, so we've already seen one objectionable thing, which is that we don't see half men, half bulls roaming around the city or sidewalks. But there are other objectionable things too, and this is the one that was really the first thing the Greeks had problems with. So I'm going to turn to possibly the earliest myth that was told about the world, right? And it's what's called the succession myth. and it involves the kings of the gods, how Zeus, who is the most important of all the Greek gods, came into power. That's one of the things that they were trying to say. Now, it starts with Uranus. Now, Uranus, you may recognize in its Latin form, Uranus. We named a planet after this guy. Uranus's original essence was the sky. He was literally the blue sky above us. And he mated with Gaia, and he had many children. But every time Gaia, the earth, would give birth, he would stuff the babies back into the earth, right? So kind of a violent shoving back. It's really horrible to think about. And of course, the earth, Gaia, got really upset about this. And so eventually, being fed up with this, she gave her youngest son a sickle, a very sharp knife that they used to like cut grain down in the fields, and said, when Uranus comes in, like do something. Uranus comes down, is about to throw Cronus back in, and Cronus castrates Uranus, deposing him from power, and Cronus becomes the most powerful king. So he basically takes over for his dad through a very violent means. Now, Cronus himself is very afraid that his own children are going to do the same thing to him, right? So, but instead of doing what Uranus did, Cronus does in my most precious and my favorite painting of all times. This is Francisco Goya, Saturn, which is the Latin name for Cronus, devouring his own children. So every time his wife, Cronus's wife, gave birth, Cronus swallowed the baby. And it happened 5 times, right? Every time Rhea would give birth, Cronus would say, give me the baby, and I'm swallowing it. Well, eventually, the mother got upset, got fed up, and said to her youngest son, Zeus, right, I'm going to protect you. So she takes a stone, wraps it in babies' swaddling clothes, and hands it to Cronus. And Zeus is taken away to Earth to be raised on the island of Crete. Eventually, Zeus grows up, he becomes a man, and he fights a big war against Cronus and overthrows him, right? For those of you who are worried about the babies inside the stomach of Cronus, Zeus had an herb that he gave to Cronus, and that made Cronus throw the babies back up. So all of Zeus's siblings also survived at the same time. How
Oh, that's so sweet.
that works and how like that operates isn't really told. But in any case, right, we have sons violently overthrowing their fathers, right? And these are gods, right? These are not like humans. These are gods doing these sort of things. So to kind of bring one more step further, before we come back to these kind of like very violent acts, Zeus is also afraid that he's going to be deposed by his son. And so what he does is he takes his wife Metis, who's pregnant, he swallows her, and then out of his head comes this figure, Athena, fully grown, right? So Athena, the goddess, is coming out of Zeus's head. There's some other gods kind of attending him. And this is how he solves the problem of sons overtaking their fathers, because he never really has a son to overthrow him by swallowing the mother at this particular time. So it's a lot of really weird things about sons and fathers being overthrown and so on. Okay, so these are the stories that the earliest Greeks tell about their world. Greeks, very soon after these were told and written down for the first time, started to think that there might be some problems with these stories, right? And the first things that they started looking at their myths and saying that's not really right was based on the idea of a theological problems. In other words, Hesiod and Homer, these early poets who are representing the gods, are not showing the gods as they ought to be, right? They ought to be better, right? Like if you're looking at like your own like king or president, and like the son kills the father to take over, that's not really the kind of thing we want our children to kind of look at. And this is exactly the problem, is that Homeric gods were terrible, right? Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things that are made to be reproach and censure among humans, adultery, mutual deception, murder, overthrowing, etc. And in fact, like that's a moral point, right? Gods ought to be better. But there are also problems with depicting the gods as humans in the first place, right? So if you look at the gods, they all look like you and me. A guy by the name of Xenophanes, who in the 6th century BC, this is about 150 years after Homer and Hesiod wrote down the first poems, he said, gods don't look like humans. And in fact, if cows had hands and could draw, and if horses had hands and could draw, gods would look like cows and would look like horses, right? So we are actually creating the gods after our own image. So the earliest Greeks who were looking at these poems and thinking, are these good for us? Really found problems with this. And in fact, Plato, who's one of the most important thinkers of the world in the 5th century, 4th century, wanted to ban poets for presenting these gods, like to actually censor and to basically get rid of poetry that showed the gods doing bad things, right? It was a kind of a moral and also educational issue.
The, of course, hidden assumption here that he hasn't specifically mentioned is nobody says any of this if they actually believe that the specific myths, the things that happen in it, were actually historical. Like there seems to be an obvious point. It's like you don't criticize these things if they weren't originally created to be historical anyways to begin with.
At any rate, all of these things were happening to the east of Greece in a
I think
place
we missed
called
something there.
Ionia. All of these things are a moral and also educational issue.
It says Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things that are matters of reproach and censure among humans: theft, adultery, and mutual deception. So he's saying that Homer and Hesiod are not speaking true things about the gods. They don't believe that the myths are historical. And there's more that can be said on this. So let's pull up what Xenophanes said. Oh shoot, don't know what's going on there. Xenophanes. All right. So he said, so this is fragments B11 and B12. They describe and implicitly criticize the stories about the gods told by Homer and Hesiod. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods also, this is the thing that was on the screen just a second ago. Period. This is B12. As they sang of numerous illicit divine deeds, theft, adultery, and mutual deceit. The basis for Xenophanes' unhappiness with the poet's account is not explained, but we may infer from the concluding call to pay due honor to the gods in Xenophanes B1 that an attribution of scandalous conduct would be incompatible with the goodness or perfection any divine being must be assumed to possess. This is from Aristotle and Plato. In the well-known fragments B14 and B16, Xenophanes comments on the general tendency of human beings to conceive of divine beings in human form. It says, but mortals suppose that gods are born, wear their own clothes, and have a voice and body. Ethiopians say their gods are snub-nosed and black. Thracians, that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. B15 adds, probably in a satirical vein, but that if horses and oxen had hands and could draw pictures, their gods would look remarkably like horses and oxen. B17 says, and baskets of pine stand round the well-built house, may represent a criticism of the common ancient belief that a god could assume possession of a physical object so as to offer protection to its possessor. The ridiculing of Pythagoras' claim to have recognized the soul of a departed friend in the voice of a barking dog, B7, together with the attacks on divination credited to Xenophanes in A52, reflect the broader denial of knowledge of divine attributes and operations set out in B34. Xenophanes is prepared to offer a positive account of the nature of the deity, see the following section, but his position appears to be that while no mortal being will ever know about the gods with any degree of certainty, we can at least avoid adopting beliefs and practices clearly at odds with the special nature any divine being must be assumed to possess. So he's using this logic to say, hey, clearly these are not correct descriptions of the gods. right? These are obviously not historical, but if you want to learn more about that, you can read Paul Vane, Did the Greeks Believe in Their Myths? An essay on the constitutive imagination. And just for clarity, that was this quote. I'll put the link in the description, but I believe it's like the Stanford Encyclopedia of something, something, something. Okay, so let's get back into our lovely presentation here.
At any rate, all of these things were happening to the east of Greece in a place called Ionia, which is a very important area for intellectual thought around the 6th century. Very important area. Lots of important people started to think about the world in different ways. And one of the things that they started to do was to really subject myth to logical reasoning. So just as science was becoming a thing, just as philosophy was becoming a thing, just as history was becoming a thing, they started to look at myth in a new way. So it's a real new intellectual thing going on in Ionia at this time. Really, really important. Okay, let's go to some other problems, right? Let's take a look at philosophy and science, right? Has anyone here run into a half man, half bull? No? Okay. What about a creature that is half lion, or third lion, third goat, third serpent? Three-headed dog? No, okay.
I think they have one of those in the Bible.
So when Plato and Aristotle started thinking about how to create kind of a scientific method, they started to come up with principles such as follows. The rules of nature today are the same as the rules of nature back then. So if we don't see half men, half bulls now, they probably didn't live back then, right? So the laws of nature just don't change because of time, they stay the same. And so when that happens, you have to start wondering, what does the bull mean? Like, why are these stories even there? One of the big problems, though, and this is something that we're going to come back to a little bit later, is that the mythical stories are really powerful. So you can't just reject them completely. You have to find a way to incorporate them into your own thinking. So there's this tension between many of the myths have things that aren't possible or aren't desirable, but you have to account for them because they're so powerful in the culture. And that's really the major issue there. Okay, let's move on to another issue. Tell another myth.
Something I also want to add is, and maybe we can talk about it later, and definitely in part 2 of this talk about Greek myths and how they impact how we read the New Testament. But something really important there is that when we look at the Greek myths and their culture, not all of them have historical aspects to it, but many of them do. So, and the beginning of archaeology and the when we started, digging for all these Greek areas and not specifically the biblical areas, so that was part of it, sir. But just like the different like Greek islands from really long ago, pre, really big Greek civilization. There are myths, and these scholars of the 17th, 18th century, they would be like, okay, obviously these myths are completely false, right? There's no truth, there's no historicity to them. And then what would happen is they would actually start doing some archaeology, and it's like, oh, wow, these places actually did exist, and the culture of the time is actually really similar to what you see in archaeology. That's really interesting. Now, of course, there was like fantastical aspects to it, so nobody accepts absolutely everything in these myths. But what is really interesting and was eye-opening for scholarship was that you had all these myths that actually had some historical aspects and sometimes even historical people, which was really, really interesting. And why that's important for this discussion is because just because the text of something like Genesis might hypothetically not have completely historical aspects to it, uh, or it might not be laid out completely literally like someone might in the 21st century might want to read it. At the same time, that doesn't mean there wasn't historical aspects. There doesn't mean that someone like Adam or Noah or or Cain and Abel or Eve. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist or they weren't historical people. They might have been based on historical people, and then the narratives were formed or tweaked just because that's what it was allowed in the culture. So um, the point being is that uh, these Greek scholars of long time ago that we're talking about, we're listening to, they they were onto something. Like they didn't fully accept it, but they also thought that there were some true and historical aspects to the stories.
Myth. Okay, so this is one of my favorites. Those of you who have seen um, uh, Clash of the Titans, the original, right? The original, not the new one, but the original one, with Harry Hamlin and the claymation, will probably remember that in that Perseus, the hero Perseus rides Pegasus. That's a lie. They're lying to you. The hero that tames Pegasus, the flying horse, is named Bellerophon, and he lives in a place called Corinth. And due to a number of issues with his family, he accidentally murders his brother. He has to go to another place. The queen falls in love with him, and then he gets sent off to go on an adventure. He is charged ultimately to go and fight the mighty Chimera, the mighty Chimera. And this is one of the greatest statues from antiquity. This is a bronze that was found in a city called Arezzo in Italy. This is the Chimera. It is part lion, part goat, and part serpent. Now, for those of you who are looking very carefully at this statue, you will see that the serpent is biting the horn of the goat. Do you guys all see how that's like the serpent's biting the horn? That's not what it looked like in antiquity. That is a reconstruction of the medieval and Renaissance period, right? So that's fake. What's not fake, however, are this. This is, if you look very carefully, you'll see that this looks like blood drops. This is where the Chimera's goat head has been wounded. If you look at the back side of it, you will see other wounds as well. Even though we don't have it, it's pretty clear that there would have been a Bellerophon Pegasus above, which would have been stabbing the Chimera below, because the way that Bellerophon kills the Chimera is he tames the winged horse Pegasus. But if you think about this, right, flying horses don't exist, therefore they couldn't have existed in the past. Hybrid monsters, goat, snake, and lion don't exist, therefore they didn't exist. So how did the Greeks explain this? What does it really mean? They ask these questions a lot, and one of the ways that they came up with answering it is a process called rationalization, okay? This is what the Greeks did to try and save the myth and to give it meaning. So it's an interpretation of the myth. It's a fancy word, I know, but I'm going to define it, and I want you all to remember this because I'm going to quiz all of you at the end, right? So this is interactive, okay? So rationalization is defined as removing all of the fantastic bits from the myth to reclaim an ordinary myth that got blown out of proportion, right? So the point here is that the Greeks would say there was probably a normal explanation, and then someone kind of mythologized it, made it seem bigger than it was. And because it is so awesome, I am going to read to you from a guy by the name of Polyphetus, who wrote rationalizing explanations, one of which was of our friend, the Chimera and Bellerophon. So I hope you don't mind me reading to you. This is a library event after all, so it makes some sense. So here we go. They say that Pegasus, a winged horse, used to carry Bellerophontes. I do not think that a horse could ever do this, not even if he had all the bird's wings in the world. For if such an animal ever existed, it would also exist now. They also say that Bellerophontes killed Chimera. The Chimera was in front a lion, in back a serpent, and a goat in between. Some think that such a beast existed, only with 3 heads and 1 body. But it is impossible for a serpent, a lion, and a goat to digest the same food. And the idea of a mortal creature breathing fire is silly. Side note, the goat's head was said to spit fire. So that's what's going on. And which of the heads did the body obey? Right? So there's biological problems all throughout. So Polyphemus always starts with a myth, and then he says, that's nonsense. The truth of the matter is this, and I'm back to reading. Bellerophontes was a Corinthian gentleman who lived in exile. He built a long ship and sailed around making raids and plundering the coastal regions. He named his ship the Pegasus. In the same way now, every ship has a name, and I think Pegasus is a name more likely to be given to a ship than to a horse. They say that the Chimera lived along a mountain. On one side of the mountain, there is a city that the Xanthians call Caria, and on the other side, the cliffs are high. In the middle, there's a huge chasm from which fire shoots forth. The name of the mountain is Chimera. And at that time, according to the people who live in the area, there was a lion living along the front approach and a serpent living along the rear. And these terrorized the woodcutters and herdsmen. It was then that Bellerophon arrived. He set fire to the mountain. He burned down the passes and he destroyed the beasts. So people in the area said, Bellerophon came on the Pegasus and destroyed the Chimera. So here, the author is basically saying that the Chimera never existed. The mountain was called Chimera. There was a fire in the middle. There was a serpent at the end on one side, a lion on the other, and the Pegasus was just a fast boat. So people could say Bellerophon flew in on his boat and killed the Chimera. So that's rationalization, making what seems to be impossible totally normal and then making sense of it all. So that's rationalization. And that was very often and commonly used in ancient Greece to basically historicize the myths that they wanted to keep for themselves. Okay. I don't know how much time we have, so I think I might just pass over this particular version to move on to our second version, which is the second way of saving myth was called allegory. An allegory is defined as literally saying one thing, but meaning something else, right? And that's actually true for modern allegories as well. So once you memorize the ancient Greek version, it means the same thing. And in Greek, for those of you who need to see more Greek in your lives, and I know Lauren misses this very much, maybe Victoria does too, is ou muthikos alethos. So you don't interpret it mythically according to the story, but the truth. Basically, allegory is saying this: no matter what the story says, it's symbolizing something deeper and more important. So you have to be smart to take what the myth says and figure out the real meaning behind it. And this is the way that most people, including Christians who still dealt with myth, took to try and save the myths, because you couldn't ignore them. Okay. Now I'm going to go to another hero that's very important to talk about
What he says about this early later is really interesting, because a lot of the early church writers on Genesis allegorize the text.
how allegory works and give you a couple of examples of it. I'm going to start with Heracles, right? You may know him by the Roman name Hercules. He is the son of Zeus, the king of the gods, and Alcmene, a local woman. And you may know that Zeus was technically married to Hera, the queen of the gods. And because Zeus dabbled with other women, Hera got really, really angry at the children of Zeus and other women. And so essentially, Hera persecuted all the children. And in what can only be described as the best trick ever done on a husband, Hera got Zeus to basically make Heracles, his son by Alcmena, have to serve a lesser king by the name of Eurystheus. And Eurystheus made Heracles go on his famous 12 labors, 12 challenges, 12 things that he had to accomplish. All because Hera wanted to torment the poor guy. So Heracles had to do 12 labors, many of which are remarkable and involve creatures that are remarkably, remarkably unbelievable. For example, the Lernaean Hydra, right? How many heads are there on the snake?
10.
4.
9.
Yeah, 9. I count 9 as well, right? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, the great thing about this ancient artist is that he color codes the different heads, like black, red, so it's easier to count and keep up, right? So this is the famous Hydra, and most people have probably not seen a 9-headed snake before. I certainly have not. I don't want to see a 1-headed snake. So a 9-headed snake is very terrifying. But many people
Make sure to subscribe if you have seen a 9-headed snake. Also subscribe if you have not.
In antiquity rationalize it. That is, they remove the fanciful thing by saying that Heracles didn't kill a 9-headed snake, but just a nest of snakes that looked like it had 9 heads, right? So that's removing the fantastic. But an allegorist would say that Heracles was trying to defend himself against multiple vices. So it's not really a snake, but those snakes are indicative of vices and bad things. Yes, Emmy, go ahead.
Is it true that the 9th head in some myths, it says it's immortal or whatever?
Yes, and Heracles had to cut off the head and then bury it and put a giant rock on top of it, just to make sure that it would not come back to harm him. Those of you who remember the Hydra story will remember that once Heracles cut off one head, 2 grew back. So he had to enlist his friend who's on the right-hand side to burn the stumps to cauterize the wound so another head wouldn't grow out. But that immortal head had to be dealt with in a different way. That's a really great question, Emmy. Thank you so much for that. But I'm going to turn to a later episode to really show you how the ancient Greeks allegorized or looked for the hidden meaning in this. And it has to do with the figure of Atlas, who is on the right, Heracles, who's in the center, and we have Athena on the left-hand side. And his 11th labor, Heracles had to go to the distant far edges of the world and get the famous golden apples of the Hesperides. You don't have to remember that specific name, but these golden apples are the presents that Zeus gave to Hera on his wedding night. So it's appropriate that he has to go get these things. I'll be right with you, Emmy, okay? So in this story, Heracles doesn't know how to get there. So he goes to Atlas, who holds heaven on his shoulders. So Atlas is literally holding up heavens. And Heracles says, hey, Atlas, you know a lot about the region. Can you tell me how to get the apples of Hesperides? And Atlas, who has been holding up the sky for ages, looks for any opportunity in the world to get out from under it. He says, Heracles, if you get under the heavens, I will go and get the apples for you. And Heracles says, okay, I guess I'll do it. So Heracles, a human, puts the heavens on his shoulders and holds them up. And the great thing about this relief on the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, do you guys see how Athena's holding up, helping Heracles hold the heavens? It's a little something to kind of show how Athena helped him. And here Atlas is bringing back the apples. Now you might be asking yourself, logically, why doesn't Atlas just leave, right? Like, why does he come back at all? Just go. And in fact, Atlas was going to go when Heracles says, hey, listen, Atlas, I'm happy to hold the heavens for the rest of my life, but I need a pillow because my shoulders are really sore from the weight. Would you hold it just for a second? And when Atlas assumes it for the second, Heracles grabs the apples and runs away. So that's how he gets the apples. But this is really important to know that he holds up the heavens, because that's an important part of the interpretation that happens in other versions. So for example, my favorite statue of all time is the so-called Heracles, the Heracles Farnese.
Perfect.
This statue was found in Rome. It's now housed in the Naples Archaeological Museum because the daughter of someone, one of the local powerful people in Rome, wanted to make a present to the Bourbon kings in Naples. So they sent this statue down And of course, the woman who gave it was one of the Farnese family. When you look at him, and normally I would ask people to tell me, like, how does Heracles look? And maybe I'll try and see if that works. If it doesn't, it'll be experiment gone awry. But someone tell me what you think Hercules looks like. Just describe him, body, mood. Anybody game for that?
Jacked.
All right, I'll tell you what I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Okay. Heracles looks tired. Heracles is slumped over on his club. The lion's skin is protecting his very beefy arm from being grated by the club. He's slouched over. The style of sculpture here is called Hellenistic Baroque because it is oversized and overemphasizes the musculature. It's a late statue. He is extremely strong, but he looks exhausted. When you look at his right arm, you'll notice that that arm goes behind. So the artist wants you to look from the front, but also wants you to go around the back, right? So it's inviting you to kind of go around the statue. And if you look at the back, you will see that the important thing is he's holding the apples.
But
So why is he super tired? He's super tired because he was holding up heavens for however long it took Atlas to get it. So this artist is playing with the myth in a number of ways to get you to think about the relationship of visualization, the story, and other clues as well. If you look in the back, I'm not sure if you can see the other statue on the other side of this hallway. The Naples Archaeological Museum is one of the most impressive with statues. You should go there when the COVID-19 thing lets up. Go to Naples, go to this museum. It's absolutely fantastic. But just like in Rationalization, the Greeks try and explain this away through allegory. And what I'm going to read to you from is a guy by the name of Herodotus. Now, some of you may have heard the name Herodotus. He's a historian. Herodotus writes about myth. And he's trying to explain the story, right? Like, men don't hold up heavens. They don't go to the far reaches to get golden apples. So here is the story by Herodotus. Zeus also fathered another son by the name of Heracles, this one with Alcmene of Thebes. This Heracles was a man who introduced the practice of philosophy to the far reaches of the world, where the sun sets. After his death, the people deified him and called a constellation in heaven Heracles after him. And here's where the allegory goes. They write that he wore a lion's skin instead of a tunic, he carried a club, and got hold of 3 apples. These are the apples, the myth says, he took away after killing a serpent with his club. That is to say, after overcoming the worthless and difficult argument inspired by keen desire, using the club of philosophy while wearing the noble purpose wrapped around him like a lion's skin. And this is how he got the 3 apples. But the 3 apples mean not apples, but virtues. Not to grow angry, not to love money, and not to love pleasure. Through the club of his enduring spirit and the skin of his very bold and prudent argument, he prevailed in his earthly struggle with petty desire, philosophizing until he died. So the myth is not really about him getting apples. It's about Heracles being a virtuous person, learning how to be a better human, not to want to have money and not to want to have desire, right? So that's rationalization, stripping away the fanciful stuff, and we have allegory, all right? Now we're going to come back to Cerberus, which is his last labor. You might remember from Harry Potter in the first movie, J.K. Rowling pays homage to this. Do you guys remember the name of the 3-headed dog? Yes, Emmy, tell us.
Fluffy.
Fluffy, absolutely fluffy, right? And of course, there's a lot of things you can do to allegorize Heracles going into the underworld and bringing up a 3-headed dog. We'll come back to that. Okay, since this is less interactive than I would have liked, we're going to do the interactive stuff together. But I'm going to ask you to read some versions, And I want you to think to yourself whether or not this is rationalization or it's allegory. I'll give you about 30 seconds apiece, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think the answer is, and you can yell at me if you think I'm wrong. Okay. So this is the explanation of a guy by the name of Hecataeus. Hecataeus, by the way, is the
Hecataeus.
predecessor of Herodotus, and Hecataeus is probably the real father of history, even though Herodotus has that moniker as well. And I'm going to have to shrink you guys so I can't see your hand. So, Kayla, you're going to have to yell at me if there's a question. A terrible snake lived on Tainarum. That's the place where Heracles was said to go into the underworld. And that it was called the Hound of Hades because anyone bitten by it would be killed immediately by its venom. It was this snake that Heracles brought to Eurystheus. And so the question is this rationalization or is this allegory? Is it taking away the three-headed dog or is it trying to explain it? Yes. Emmy, you want to give it a shot?
I think it's rationalization
Can you explain why you think it's rationalization?
because it's taking away the part about the dog. Like it just turns it into a snake. It's not actually like.
Yeah, very good. That's exactly right, right? You're not trying to explain.
This girl is like a genius. And just to let you know, in like 6 years, when this 7, 8-year-old girl, when you're watching this in 6 years, she's going to be like done with her PhD. So be on the lookout. Emmy, that's all we know about her, but she's going to be good.
Like Cerberus in any real way. You're not trying to make it fit by finding something hidden beneath it, but you're just trying to like take away the weird stuff. Where are the three heads? There is none, right? It's just the Hound of Hades is because the venom's pretty bad, right? Good. All right. Anyone? So I'll tell you who this is. So this is one of my favorite pots. You'll see a figure emerging out of the thigh of another figure. If you look up above and read Greek, this says Zeus. It has a weird zdeta in early form of Greek. You'll see here it says Dionysus. This is the god Dionysus who is ultimately born out of the thigh of Zeus. Now, can we all agree?
Sounds painful.
That children tend not to grow out of thighs, right? So there's got to be an attempt to figure out a way to explain this. Of course, Dionysus was son of Zeus and another woman. So we have this explanation coming up, which is Jupiter slept with Semele, and from her father Liber, this is Dionysus in Latin, was born. When Jupiter came to her with his thunderbolt, she, Semele, was burned to a crisp. He, the father, took the boy from her, put him in his thigh, and later handed him over to Maro to be raised. This is Dionysus. Now let us examine the story's secret meaning. He is said to be born of Semele, as if from the Greek word somalion, which translates to loose body in Latin. And so what the myth is really saying is that intoxication is born from sexual appetite, right? Give you a couple seconds to think about what this is, all right? And the key ought to be secret meaning, right? If you're trying to find the secret meaning of something,
Well, he kind of just gave it away.
This is allegory. Emmy, is that what you're going to say, allegory? Awesome. Well done. All right. Now,
I believe she was going to say that.
allegory oftentimes tries to use language to explain it, right? So there's no etymological connection between the word Semele, the mother, and somalion, but authors will do crazy kind of explanations to try and find out the symbolic or secret meaning of it, right? So that's a really good example of what allegory is. All right, we're not done. We have lots more to do. So Heraclitus wrote a whole work on trying to figure out the myths in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And in one part of the Iliad, Diomedes, a Greek, he's a human, with Athena's help, wounds the goddess Aphrodite. Aphrodite, not used to being wounded, goes off and cries to her mother, and there's a long story. It's a really great episode in the Iliad, in book 5. At any rate, Heraclitus writes the following. Diomedes, with Athena's help, that is to say, with wisdom, as his ally, wounded Aphrodite, that is foolishness, aphrosune, the Greek word for foolishness. Not, of course, a goddess, but the foolishness of his barbarian adversaries. So the question is this rationalization or is this allegory? All right, Emmy, you seem to be the one on the spot.
Allegory.
Wait, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. I am going to think that it would be allegory because it explains it in a different way.
Yeah, so the surface meaning of the myth, right, is one thing, but then you have to look deep inside to see what's really saying. So what this is saying is Diomedes, right, is wise and wisdom beats foolishness, right?
Mhm.
So being smart is better than being foolish, right? So this is really just a coded way of talking about like what actually is going on. Now this is foolishness, like this whole interpretive approach is really crazy, and we'll see a couple examples down the road. But we have another one to do, and by golly, we should do more because this is super fun. Remember Theseus? He kills the Minotaur, half man, half bull. Here is what Philocarus, he's a historian of the 3rd century BC. I'll quickly read this through. People say that Minos's bull, the Minotaur, was a monstrous half man, half bull that was born of Pasiphae in a bull, lived in a labyrinth, fed on human victims, and was killed by Theseus. But here's the truth. The locals tell us that there was a Cretan man named Taurus, which in Greek means bull, and he happened to be a remarkably cruel general under Minos's command. He used to keep his Athenian hostages in a prison, which he called the labyrinth, until they died. One day, Taurus allowed Theseus, one of the hostages, to compete in the funeral games for Minos' son Androgeos. Theseus is so impressive that he provokes desire in Ariadne, Minos' daughter, who convinces Minos to let all the hostages go free. What do we have here? All right, Emmy, you seem to be the only person interested in playing along, so I'm going to give you full breadth to do what you want to do.
Okay. I think, or I'm under the impression that it's explaining it in a different way again. So allegory.
Is it saying that there's a secret meaning of the Minotaur?
No.
No.
So is there a half man, half bull?
Everybody makes mistakes, even the best scholars. Give me a second chance.
Not in history right now.
Yeah, that's right. So basically you're saying there's no half man, half bull. It's just a person by the name of Bull. It's like if my name were Bull, right? And then someone said like Bull is kind of a mean guy. He's Minos's bull. He's a Minotaur, and he makes bad things. So actually, this is rationalization. It's kind of a tough one, but it's rationalization. Yeah, good. Okay, so we're going to continue just a little bit more. I'm going to take you to the Christian world, and I think we have just a few more minutes, so this is a good place to kind of end. So the Christians, right, say after the 2nd century AD, so they borrowed and they were educated in Greek and Roman culture, and so they took with them the stories. But they could not accept the stories at face value, right? Because they're monotheists, they believe in one God. The Romans and Greeks believed in many gods, so they had to explain away. The way that Christians tended to do this was through allegory, right? Finding the secret meaning for this, right? For those of you who have not been to Rome, this is in the Borghese, the Galleria Borghese. Beautiful place, these beautiful statues of Bernini. This is the story of Apollo chasing after Daphne. The Greek word Daphne means laurel, so her name is Laurel Tree, right? The name Laurel is the same thing as Daphne. And here Bernini has really captured the moment that she starts to become a laurel tree because she evades the embraces of Apollo. The reason why I love the statue so much is if you look at the hand of Apollo on her body, you'll notice that Bernini has put bark underneath the hand so that Apollo never touches her. But if you look really carefully, this is a tour de force in sculpture. See how there's a space underneath the thumb? Even the thumb is not touching. So there's no contact between Apollo and his beloved Daphne. But in ancient Greece, the story was to explain where the laurel tree came from and why Apollo wears a laurel wreath. So laurel wreath is his kind of signature. Now, of course, the Christians can't adopt that. So what they said was as follows. I'm reading from a late 13th century allegory of this. Daphne symbolizes chastity, which, like the laurel tree, remains as cool as a river and always blooms but never bears fruit. So Daphne becomes a model of virginity and the chastity. And so they explain it not as a myth of a god running after her, but as symbolizing something much, much, much deeper. It's a great way to kind of explain away very complicated and controversial things. And again, you can see how close the thumb is without actually touching the body. It's really quite amazing. And you can do that also with the sirens, for example, which are the singing birds. Odysseus ties himself to a mast so he can listen to the song, but won't be shipwrecked, which is what happens to people who are guided or attracted by their song. And the Christians interpreted the sirens as being the temptations of pleasure, right? All the pleasurable things coming at you at once during a Christian's voyage through life, right? So they embraced the stories, but they explained them in a very particular way to re-emphasize the Christian message that was being transmitted by the Bible and other texts of that religion. Okay, I cannot not show you this, which is later versions of taking these myths and making them appropriate for the modern world. So this is the Northern General Winfield Scott clubbing down the 7 generals, the Confederate leaders of the succession. And this is actually a print from a newspaper or a pamphlet about the Hercules of the Union slaying the great dragon of succession, which I find to be quite remarkable. And Scott's called the Hercules of the Union. And you can see that the club, this is kind of allegorical to some degree, right? It's making a moral comment about Hydra and Hercules, and Hercules is clubbing them with justice and virtue, right? Better, if I might say so, is the use of Vladimir Putin. During his birthday celebration one year, he got a bunch of paintings and pictures made for him. Now, if you can read Cyrillic, right, you can see Putin sword and shield against a only 4-headed Hydra. Can you guys read what this says in Cyrillic? This is Canada with the maple leaf. This is the European Union. That's the Russian for European Union, Europe. And this, of course, is the word for Japan. But if you look at the bottom, you'll see that the head is the United States.
What?
And I find that remarkable that we still are using these images to do that. I see that we're running up right at 4 o'clock. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I just want to thank you for listening. Emmy, thank you for answering all the questions. You did great. And I'm happy to stay around as long as anyone would want for me to answer questions. I have nothing to do until 6:30, so I'm yours until Kaylee tells us we have to stop. So, yeah. Bart.
Okay. Well, we're not going to be answering questions here today, but I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Make sure to stay tuned for the next one we do on this topic, where we will talk about specific instances where we can see historical events occurring, and then the Greeks would make myths about it. There's also interesting points where there are like places where someone would say, "Hey, I'm a descendant from a god," when clearly they were not a descendant from a god, which is really interesting because, of course, Luke and Jesus' genealogy says that Jesus was the descendant of Adam, and he kind of portrays it as he's like the son of God in that way, or son of man, or something weird going on there, right? So, yeah, make sure you stay tuned for those. The point being, just to make this clear, is I'm not saying that the Genesis writer was in this Greek culture or he copied myths or something like that. But what I am saying is that the New Testament writers, they grew up in this culture. Okay, we maybe not Paul or maybe not Jesus explicitly in this Greek culture, although Paul was, well, at least the writer of Paul's letters. The final product clearly had Greek ideas in it. Okay, that no scholar debates that. And what's really interesting about that is if there are Greek ideas in the New Testament, then there's a really high chance that they would be around this culture that doesn't just fully accept myths. Okay, they doubt it. Now, sure, many might have accepted them. At the same time, there was clearly a lot that did not, and therefore we we can open that door up to saying, hey, maybe the New Testament writers, maybe they don't actually think that Adam was a historical person, or maybe they don't think that the text is describing something that literally happened just like that. Maybe they thought Adam was historical, but not necessarily the snake or the tree. Of course, later on you get early church fathers that love to allegorize the text, and what we cannot do, if there's one thing you can learn from this, is that you cannot simply assume that the New Testament writers, simply just because they quote something, because they mention something, we cannot just simply assume that they thought they were historical. Anyways, thank you for watching. It's been a pleasure, and until next time.